My name is Steve Nordby, and this presentation is entitled Effectiveness of Response to Intervention Programs. The presentation is designed to fulfill the requirements for AEP 873, Critical Issues in Education. The issues that I researched related to the effectiveness of the three-tier intervention model, and more specifically, the effectiveness in the areas of reading, math, and for use with ELL students. In addition, I wanted to learn more about the version of RtI promoted by the Kansas State Department of Education under the name MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. I learned that although response to intervention programs are all the rage now in education, they're not new concepts and have been around for several decades. The IDEA and ESEA laws have simply brought it to the forefront of educators' consciousness. I also learned that there was no consistent definition for an RtI program. There seemed to be as many definitions and approaches as there are researchers investigating different techniques. Despite the differing approaches, most RtI models can be symbolized with a period of services that I'll show later. This seems to me to be a pretty all-encompassing definition of RtI in all of the different versions that I was able to find. It really seems to encompass a lot of the different components, including assessment and intervention. RtI is an assessment and intervention process for systematically monitoring student progress and making decisions about the need for instructional modifications or increasingly intensified services using progress monitoring data. As I mentioned earlier, the pyramid has come to symbolize RtI programs and services. Most programs use 3 tiers of services to address student needs. However, some models espouse a 4th tier. As the levels of services move from the bottom to the top, there are fewer students involved, while the time and intensity devoted to instruction and intervention increase. At the bottom of the pyramid is Tier 1. This is the core instructional element. All students receive this core. As part of the core instruction, the expectation is that teachers will be using research-based practices. During Tier 1, students are assessed using screening assessments to determine if there is a pressing academic need for additional services. If students are identified as having an instructional need, they're placed in programs that are part of Tier 2 services. During Tier 2 intervention, students receive additional educational services beyond core instruction. RtI models usually insist on students receiving services through research-based programs that focus on basic skills. Often these are scripted programs. Students would be regularly assessed to determine the effectiveness of the services, otherwise known as the student's response to intervention, which gives RtI its name. Students that respond to the intervention may be placed back into Tier 1 programs. Students that do not respond to Tier 2 may be placed into Tier 3 interventions. These services are even more targeted and individualized. These services are conducted in addition to the other tiers that students receive. I found a great deal of research into the effectiveness of RtI in the area of reading. Much of this research was the product of the Reading First movement, which relied heavily on the 3-tier model. Most of the research into RtI has been conducted in the lower elementary grades and focused on the 5 basic components of reading. The research has shown that these programs have had great success in identifying students with academic needs early and providing successful intervention services. I was disappointed that much of the research on reading that I found took place prior to our 5-year time frame for this project. I found less research into the effectiveness of RtI in math, but what I did find was very positive. Similar to the research in reading, I found that most of the successful math programs focused on essential skills such as computation and fact fluency. There was also a scarcity of data relating to RtI in the upper grades. The research on ELL students was very promising regarding RtI services. I found that several studies highlighted the great potential of RtI, and the surprising finding was that students although they may have multiple languages and English may be their second language, they still benefited from intervention services conducted in English. Researchers did concede that much more work needs to be done in relation to RTI and ELL learners. I was very disappointed in the lack of research when it came to ELL and math. I think more research has been done in reading primarily because of the large amounts of money that has been put into reading as a result of Reading First and best practices resulting from Reading First studies. Now on to Kansas MTSS. The RTI program that's endorsed by the state of Kansas is called MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. Although RTI philosophies are embedded into MTSS, it involves much more. MTSS is the model that Kansas State Department of Education uses when they work with buildings placed on improvement for their accreditation status. As you can see by the symbol at the bottom, there's much more than a pyramid involved in MTSS and the MTSS philosophy. Once again, as you can see by the graphic, there is a pyramid, though, involved, and the tiers have been replaced from Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 to all, few, or some, referring to the relative amounts of students being served at each tier. Much like the other models of RTI, MTSS uses regular assessment at each tier to identify which students move from all, few, or some levels. There are also some other components on the outside of the pyramid that relate to a more larger systemic change in the way that a school operates. That's a big part of the MTSS philosophy. This is why it has become the model for the Kansas State Department of Education for building-wide change. When buildings undergo training in MTSS practices, they will evaluate all of the building systems involving these 6 components: leadership, empowering culture, professional development, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. It's a very thorough process taking a look at all areas of how a school functions and delivers services to students. This training is really different than most other RTI models in that it can only be received from trained state facilitators that use a very specific set of training materials. Although MTSS is based on successful RTI methods, it's a new program, just being launched in the last 2 years. Therefore, no long-term studies have been conducted to show its effectiveness. I look forward to seeing the data on the use of MTSS when it's available, as Kansas has really invested a great deal of time and effort into it. As I said earlier, the individual components are research-based, but no studies have been conducted on the program as a whole. Most RTI models don't take into account the other 6 components of how a school operates. Through my research, I've learned about the successful use of RTI for reading, math, and the promise that's been shown for ESL learners. Although more research needs to be done to evaluate the conditions that make RTI programs successful in older learners, what has been conducted as far as younger learners has been very, very promising and successful. I was also able to learn more about the components that comprise MTSS in Kansas and how they relate to more than just student interventions, but focus on systematic school improvement. I have attached my sources to this presentation. If you're interested in discussing RTI or MTSS further, please contact me. Thank you for your time and attention to this.